second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I've listened very attentively to the minister's presentation. He did indicate that this would be the last time the government would be promoting tax amnesty in TNT. I want to tell the Minister of Finance if he has lost touch with reality. The people are saying this is the last time you will be given the opportunity to present a budget in this parliament. Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President, may I indicate that I would like to warmly congratulate our esteemed political leader who delivered a very powerful, excellent response in the other place to the budget presentation of the Minister of Finance. And Mr. President, just a few days ago, it was predicted by the very honorable leader of the United National Congress, and I dare say the incoming Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, that there's bacchanal in the PNM. Bacchanal in the PNM. And we only have to look at the papers today. Headline, bacchanal in the holiday. That is what is going on, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, we know what is taking place. A divided house cannot stand. It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. Mr. President, let me indicate, as we get into this budget, several areas and so on we want to deal with, but time would not permit us to deal with those areas. But, Mr. President, may I say, this is the 10th and final budget of the Minister of Finance. It marks the end of a lost decade of Trinidad and Tobago, a decade of despair, a decade of debt, a decade of decay and decimation and destruction in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. President, in this decade, the economy contracted by some 19% measured in real GDP from 2015 to 2024. In this lost decade, foreign exchange became scarce. Food prices at the groceries ran away, and the crime rate spiked. And it's still rising, Mr. President. In fact, under this outgoing, limping, lame duck government, Mr. President, 2024 will be the bloodiest year on record in Trinidad and Tobago. In that lost decade, Mr. President, our country was overwhelmed by illegal immigration due to a collapsed border, and our energy sector was decimated, as is evidenced, Mr. President, by significant declines in both oil and natural gas and the closure of a number of industrial plants, including the Pointe-a-Pierre refinery, which may never, if you give the PNM the opportunity, it will never be restarted, Mr. President. These crushing blows inflicted by this incompetent and dangerous PNM government did not spare the citizens. the government, Mr. President, of the Minister of Finance is the most anti-worker, anti-labor, anti-trade union government in history. Mr. President, the most affected are not their elitist friends of the PNM who have passports and homes in the United States, but rather it is those who live in poverty and the middle class families and the single mothers and parents who are struggling to keep their heads above water. These are the ones who are feeling the pain. The working poor, Mr. President, including the public servants, living on 2013 wages in 2024. The erosion of purchasing power and the constant increases in fuel prices at the pump are only part of the legacy of this outgoing administration and Minister of Finance, who, Mr. President, as you know, sings, that is the minister, sings one song here in the Parliament, and then, Mr. President, he sings another song in an affidavit that was tendered to the courts earlier this year. That is what is happening. So, Mr. President, the minister speaks of 3 consecutive years of economic growth. That is his own narrative coming out of the Ministry of Finance and not from the Central Statistical Office. The growth figures reported for 2023 and 2024 as presented in the review of the economy are from the Minister of Finance and not the Central Statistical Office. Mr. President, not only do we have a lost decade of economic growth, but we now seemingly have the usurpation of independent office. That is the independent office of the CSO. And the same thing is happening, Mr. President, to the central bank. No one believes the Minister of Finance version of the economy. His reign is coming to an end. And even inside the PNM, his political sun will soon set. Mr. President, his legacy, that is, will always be the lost decade. That would be his legacy, Mr. President. So when we look at what is taking place in this nation, Mr. President, we see a government the government, Mr. President, placing the workers under severe assault. We observe, Mr. President, that, and we have to remind the population that under the UNC, we commenced the construction of 200 schools and completed over 100. We have to remind the people. The UNC increased the HSF by approximately $2 billion US dollars. We have to remind the people of this, Mr. President, lest they forget. Mr. President, we have to remind the population that under the UNC, a tertiary participation rate of over 60% was achieved. We attracted the highest level of direct foreign investment in Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. President. We improved the quality and access to health services and social services. We recorded the lowest crime level in 33 years in Trinidad and Tobago. So when we look, Mr. President, at our situation in Trinidad and Tobago, we see where the United National Congress has held and has advanced the interests of the masses in a way that this PNM government has failed to achieve that objective. Mr. President, I want to tell you that under the macroeconomic framework, all the major indicators are showing us that the economy of this country is heading south. Whether we look at what has happened with the debt and the borrowings, Mr. President, would you believe that under this administration, in the last 10 years, we have borrowed close to $120 billion under this PNM government? When we left office, our debt to GDP was just about 42.5%. Today, it is close to 76%. That is where we are. So the government is increasing borrowings, mortgaging the future of our country and our children in particular. So we have challenges under this regime. Inflation, the minister said, is at its lowest, yet still the cost of living is at its highest in this country. So on the one hand, inflation is low, and on the other hand, Mr. President, the cost of living is extremely high. Now, Mr. President, we want to look at what the minister said about unemployment and underemployment. And what we are seeing, Mr. President, is a situation where unemployment is supposed to be 5.4%. It was supposed to be 4.1% 1 year ago. It is now 5.4% according to data coming out from the CSO. But it does not tell the full story, because from 2015, Mr. President, to the present time, we have had some 66,000 workers losing their jobs. That is the reality. Those are the statistics that we have before us. Mr. President, under the labor market today, the labor force is shrinking. That is what we are experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago today. Unemployment among young people is rising in our nation, Mr. President. So, even though we are getting information from the minister and the government that unemployment is 5.4%, and that is reasonable, our estimation is that based on data from the central bank, over 66,000 workers have lost their jobs, Mr. President. That is the reality. And then the minister tells us, Mr. President, that he is offering a 5% increase in salaries and wages to public servants and public sector workers, and that he has assigned a $2 increase of minimum wages to CPEP, MTS, Mr. President, and URP. But the last time I checked, MTS has a union called the Transport and Industrial Workers Union. And they negotiate and bargain on behalf of MTS workers. So how can a minister be telling MTS workers that they are now falling under the minimum wages law of the country? It just sounds confusing. Like the minister is not aware of what is happening in the arena of industrial relations. You cannot stay on the floor of the parliament floor, Mr. President, and simply by decree announce a 5% increase in wages for public sector workers. And the minister instructs the CPO to meet with these unions. Mr. President, under this government, collective bargaining has been the government has destroyed collective bargaining in Trinidad and Tobago. That is what has happened. So they are negotiating and issuing decrees, Mr. President, from the parliamentary floor. So this is highly dangerous, Mr. President. So workers are under pressure. We know. We experience it. But the government has to observe, and they must at least, Mr. President, respect the collective bargaining process. Mr. President, labor, the other point I want to address is youth unemployment. Youth unemployment, Mr. President, is extremely high according to the data that we have from the CSO. In fact, we have seen the largest share of jobless individuals among the age range of 15 to 29 years, Mr. President. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago does not fully appreciate that when you have so many young people unemployed, you lay the basis for these young people being attracted to recruitment and to the recruitment via gangs because they are unemployed, Mr. President. And that is a danger that I wish to draw to your attention and to the attention of this nation. Mr. President, inflation and what I call the explosive rise in the cost of living. Mr. President, data is showing that between September 2015 to December 31st, 2023, there has been a noticeable increase across various price indices in Trinidad and Tobago. The retail price index, Mr. President, according to CSO data during the period that we are looking at, rose by 21.8%, indicating a broad rise in consumer prices over the said period, Mr. President. However, the food price index saw an even steeper increase of 43.5%, suggesting that food prices have outpaced general inflation. Mr. President, among the food items that would have experienced these huge price increases were butter, margarine, and edible oils, which experienced, Mr. President, the most significant rise at around 65.8%. The price of other essential food categories, such as bread, Mr. President, cereals, meat, and fish, also increased substantially, with each category witnessing increases of 37.6%, 34%, and 32.2%, respectively. That is where we are when it comes to inflation and the cost of living. So when the minister is telling us that inflation is at less than 1%, Mr. President, that might be so. But look at the reality facing the ground in this country, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, these numbers indicate that the cost of basic food items has become significantly higher, putting severe strain on ordinary workers and citizens. Mr. President, I would like to draw to your attention that the fruits and vegetable price indices also showed significant increases of 45.8% and 57.8% respectively. And this is particularly concerning for food security in this country. High prices, Mr. President, for fruits and vegetables are leading to decreased consumption of these essential food groups, contributing to the process of nutritional deficiency and long-term health issues, Mr. President. I think the government has to pay attention to what is taking place in this arena, Mr. President, as it relates to the whole issue of food, inflation, the high cost of living. Mr. President, these are issues that must be addressed by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. President, I also want to pay attention to what is called the growth of the non-energy and tradable sector. Mr. President, the rising non-energy tradable to non-tradable ratio of output in Trinidad and Tobago is a worrying sign of the country. The country shift towards what is called non-tradable sector, which does not generate, Mr. President, any foreign exchange. And this is cause for concern because this trend, combined with a decline in foreign exchange reserves and rising foreign debt, Mr. President, presents a serious economic risk for our nation. So the matter of the government paying attention, Mr. President, to tradables versus non-tradables and giving more preference to non-tradable or tradables, non-tradables, Mr. President, this is leading to a drain of our foreign exchange, and it is leading to rising debt and borrowings. So it is an area that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has to pay attention to, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also paid attention to the minister's budget speech when he spoke about reduced revenues. And he just made the point, the Honorable Minister, that is, that Trinidad and Tobago is in a very difficult place. But he said that here now. But when he made his budget statement in the other place, Mr. President, it was the rain has stopped and the sun is shining. But today, we are being told that things are very difficult. So what will happen, Mr. President? What will happen is that the government of this country will be selling out the family jewels. The Honorable Minister mentioned some of the family jewels that the minister is looking at, and it is in the budget. So we want to ask the Honorable Minister which other family jewels he intends to sell in 2024, 2025. We want to know, Mr. President, whether the government intends to sell out the Port Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. We want to know if they're going to sell out the port. We want to know, Mr. President, if the government intends to sell or to privatize further First Citizens Bank. They must tell the country if they're going to sell out First Citizens Bank. We want the government to tell Trinidad and Tobago whether their intention is to sell out National Petroleum under the guise of liberalization and deregulation. And Mr. President, we want the government to tell Trinidad and Tobago whether it is their intention to sell out TSTT. Is the government going to sell TSTT to ATN, which is the Atlantic Telecommunication Network, based in Beverly Hills, Atlanta? Mr. President, these are issues that we want to know, and the people are crying out for answers. Now, Mr. President, in addition to this, the government must tell this country how come they sold 56.53% shares of CLECO in MHIL, Methanol Holdings International Limited, for $300 million less than the valuation. The government must tell the country why they undervalued that MHIL and sold it to the Proman group of companies through a company called Consolidated Energy Limited. We need answers, Mr. President, on that question that I've raised. Mr. President, this government recently announced that they were shortlisting 3 companies to take charge of either the lease or sale of Petrotrin refinery. Point up here. Mr. President, what is interesting in this matter, and I'm calling on the government to provide us with some answers. Mr. President, 3 companies were shortlisted. One called Crow Consortium. The other one is Inca Refinery. And the other one is Oando. Mr. President, these are the 3 companies that were shortlisted. When we checked the registry to get information on these companies, we realized that Crow Consortium is made up of 3 locally incorporated companies. One called Ocala, the other one is DR Commodities, and the other one is Chemitech. These are the 3 companies falling under Crow Consortium. Mr. President, what we found interesting is that when we did a search for Crow Consortium, it yielded no results. Mr. President, may I repeat? A search was conducted on the online system for Crow CRO Consortium, that is the parent company of these 3 locally incorporated companies, and the search yielded no results. It means that Crow Consortium is not legally incorporated under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, Mr. President, the question must be asked, if this company is not legally incorporated under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, how come this company was shortlisted by the cabinet of the government of the Honorable Prime Minister? How, Mr. President? And Mr. President, what is even more alarming, if I may say, is this. You have every company there is questionable and are suspicious. Everyone. And you know, the DR Commodities was formerly DR Logistic. But when we check DR Commodity, it is the parent company of this local company, but it is based in India. And when we check the Indian company, we realize on the board of directors were 2 associates and family members of Jindal. That is what we are seeing, 2 members of the Jindal family on the board of directors of the parent company called DR Commodities. So, Mr. President, this government, we are calling on the government to scrap that entire process. We are calling on the government to scrap that entire process. Because, and what is even more important, Ocala is a Venezuelan company engaging in oil and gas. It's a holdings company, Mr. President, that is sanctioned by the United States. How come this government is shortlisting a company that is sanctioned by the United States to take over our Point-a-Pierre refinery? Mr. President, you know what has happened? Jindal went through the front door and he came through the back door. That is what is happening. So we want the government to scrap that entire project. It is too corrupt. And the government must answer. In fact, we need a criminal forensic investigation into this entire transaction. Mr. President, the title of this budget is Steadfast and Resolute, Pathways to Prosperity. Mr. President, I want to ask Trinidad and Tobago and you, through you, Mr. President, pathways to prosperity for whom? Mr. President, I want to ask if it is pathways to prosperity for the gentleman who built the most expensive road from the main road to Blenheim, official residence of the Prime Minister, for $5 million. The road is less than half a mile. I want to know if that is pathway to prosperity. And you know who is the company? Alan Warner Company. Mr. President, the Prime Minister of this country must tell us why his resident in Tobago started off at $5 million and it gone to 40 and counting. Why? Why this exorbitant increase? We need answers. Mr. President, we also want to bring to your attention a law that was passed in this parliament in 2016 that exempted anyone who is building multi-dwelling, multi-family, and multi-residential properties in this country between the period of July of 2016 to December 31st, 2025. They are not paying any taxes on the sale of their units. So we ask questions. There is a building on Picton Street owned by a senior cabinet minister with 20 apartments contained therein, being sold at $3 million apiece, which is $60 million. Wow. We want the government, through that minister, to tell Trinidad and Tobago if he has been exempted under the law from paying any taxes, including property taxes. No, I say a senior member. Mr. President, I also asked a question. The 46 private townhouses that were constructed by Inez Gate.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Inez Gate. We want to know if those apartments were in fact exempted from profits, from taxes. And then the last one I want to get clarification on. There are 5 apartments located in a place called Landate. No, known as Forest Hills.
Senator Mark, in order being raised.
46-1, Mr. President, what's the relevance to the appropriation bill?
Senator Mark, you're wrapping up. You have 4 more minutes.
So I'm asking the question. We want to know if those 5 palatial apartments, multi-dwelling, multi-residential, multi-million-dollar apartments that is on a location called Landate, now known as Forest Hills, whether the Prime Minister is the owner of those 5 apartments and whether the Prime Minister is in fact paying any taxes on those apartments. These are questions that the people are asking, Mr. President. Mr. President, I think that there's also an issue of monopolization of the pharmaceutical and the food industry by a small group of people supported by the government that is causing pharmaceutical prices to go up and food prices to go up in this country. So we ask the government to level the playing field, and we ask the Fair Trade Commission to awaken from their deep slumber like Rip Van Winkle. There's a monopolization of the pharmaceutical and food industry by this monopoly that you have in this country. Mr. President, I know that I have limited time because of the 40 minutes, and I have a lot of things to say, but I can't. What I would like to say in closing, Mr. President, yes, for you is nothing because you are nothing. Yes, Mr. President, in closing, may I say, Mr. President, it's only a matter of time before the people decide. The sun will rise again. And when the sun rises in this country, its powerful rays will envelop and illuminate the pathway of all and discriminate against none. We are saying, Mr. President, that the people are calling for elections now. The people are saying that the PNM has to go. And we are seeing from the measures announced in this budget and outline will not make the poor rich, but it will make the rich richer. It will not improve the livelihoods of the middle class. It will depress their entire living and working environment. So, Mr. President, the government has failed the people. The time has come for the government to call elections and let the people decide in Trinidad and Tobago. You cannot continue institutionalizing robbery in this country. You cannot continue, Mr. President, utilizing and weaponizing the government apparatus to make a few of the people in the government and outside of the government rich and healthy. And in closing, Mr. President, the property tax. I want to ask the question in closing. Is a former Attorney General whose family collecting $200 million at the end of this decade, will that family or will these members of the family of that Attorney General former be paying any property tax? None. Will they be paying commercial tax? None. No, Mr. President, they will not be paying commercial tax. That's why we say scrap the property tax. Mr. President, I thank you.